First Christmas present of the year. Oh my goodness. It looks so good.
Christmas is almost here. Tree is decorated. We've got the stockings out. Problem is, there's nowhere to hang it. So, I think what we're going to have to do is build a new mantle, maybe a little veneer stone. That way, Santa has a place to put all the coal, because he's not going to give him anything else. So to build this mantle, we're going to be using this piece of white oak. Now it's just a little over 9 feet wide and a little wider than 13 inches, depending on where you measure it from. So I'm going to set my tape measure to 4 feet because that is going to be the size of this mantle. Now, the reason I'm going to set my tape measure at the 4 feet is because I want to decide what piece I want my top and my face to be on this mantle. The reason be is that I plan on ripping it in half and just having that board just fold right over the edge. That way I have a grain match running across, and any of the grain that runs off of the edge will also run off the edge and down the face as well. So I want to pick the best piece that's going to match what we need here to be what you're going to see the most of, which is, of course, the top and the face. This half over here, although I do like this half, it's very straight grain. There's only one cathedral right here in the middle. Whereas if we move down this direction, there are at least 2 or 3 cathedrals over here, but also this piece of white oak gets a little bit darker on this half as opposed to that half. Now, in my opinion, I kind of like this half better. So if I use this half for the top and the face, and then I mill this piece to fit right here on the end of this, then that darker color running across will blend together as it then wraps underneath. And there won't be a stark color difference between the two. So the first thing that I needed to do was to rip this piece of white oak down to roughly the right width. Now, for years, I used a table saw or a skill saw with a guide to make this kind of cut, but since I have a track saw, it just made sense to use it. And because I'm trying to keep a grain match here, I went ahead and made a few pencil marks to help keep the boards aligned as I go. Now, this is where I take my earlier advice and I chuck it out the window. You see, I definitely could have made this entire mantle out of this one piece of white oak, but the problem was I really liked the grain pattern right in the middle of the board. So after much deliberation, that's where I made my marks before I took it over to the miter saw to cut it down to size. And by size, I mean a few inches longer than it needs to be. Now, since I took the top and face of the mantle out of the middle of the board, this meant that I now didn't have enough material left over to make the bottom of the mantle. So while I was at the miter saw, I cut another piece of white oak in half before heading to the table saw to rip them all down to the desired sizes. The depth of the mantle is going to be 7.5 inches and 5 inches tall. I chose 7.5 inches deep because I'm also installing some veneer stone around the fireplace, and it's about 1.5 inches thick, which should leave me with a reveal of approximately 5 inches. Next, I decided how to orientate the two pieces I cut in half for the bottom, making sure the grain was running in the same direction and the color was as close as possible before I glue them together. Then I made a few alignment marks with a pencil for some biscuits, and normally you wouldn't need biscuits for this, but you'll notice that when I push down on one end of the board, the other side lifts just a little bit because it has a bow in it. And my figuring is that if you have two boards going the opposite way and you pin them together with some biscuits, it makes a straight board, right? At least in theory. And honestly, it worked like a charm. Next, I put some glue on the biscuits before I installed them. Man, all this talk about biscuits is kind of making me want some fresh, hot out of the oven biscuits with some butter and homemade strawberry jelly on top. Anyways, after I finished installing the biscuits, I then stuck the two pieces together, installed 6 clamps, and wiped off the excess glue. Then I thought, what this needs is more clamps. So I added two more clamps, when suddenly the rubber tip shot off the clamp when I was tightening it down. So, like any gentleman, I put the rubber back on my tool before clamping it down. You know, you really have to be careful when clamping your wood that the rubber is on all the way. That's how accidents happen. Anyway, I then set it aside to dry before moving on to the next task, which is to cut the 45-degree angles using the table saw. So I marked a piece of scrap white oak at 5 inches, because that's the height of the mantle, then moved the fence until it lined up with my mark, and did a little test cut. And with the thumbs up, I was ready to cut the front board of this mantle. Once I ran it through on one side, I flipped it around and ran it through again. Now that both sides had a 45-degree angle on them, I went back to the miter saw so I could cut it down to the correct length. Now, if you remember, I told you that I cut this piece long enough to wrap it around both sides for a nice clean grain match. So I cut off the two ends. Then I needed to cut my 45 on both of the side pieces. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, Michael, why didn't you just flip over the sideboards and it's a perfect fit without needing to make a second cut? But I'd reply, because then the grain wouldn't match, you silly goose. After that, my bottom board was dry and ready to be milled down flat. So I pulled out the old thickness planer and ran it through until it was flat on one side. Flipped it over and wash, rinse, repeat. Now, since I wanted all my boards to be the same thickness, which they weren't at this point, I ran all of my other boards through at the same time, making sure they were face down so that it would only remove material from the backside. This way it wouldn't change my overall length. Then I ripped it down to size. Now, the reason I didn't just cut my 45-degree angle on this is because I still needed to choose my grain pattern. I know, he's talking about grain pattern again, but picking the right grain orientation is what takes your project from DIY looking to professional looking, so don't knock it till you try it. Once I picked out the pattern I liked, I marked the ends and went back to the table saw, where I thought, hey, if I just put an offcut against the blade, I could just measure 7.5 inches off the edge of the block to the fence, and I wouldn't have to get down and eyeball it. So I did. After that, I ran both the top and bottom board through the table saw before going back to the miter saw and cutting off the ends using those marks that I made earlier. Now, to hold everything together and help keep things aligned during the glue up, I decided to use some more biscuits. So I laid out where I wanted them to be, made a few marks, and I still needed to cut off the ends of the side pieces to length. So I did that real quick. And then started plunging holes. Holes? That doesn't sound right. Maybe grooves? Yeah, let's go with that. Now, I did do a practice groove on a piece of scrap to make sure that I didn't cut all the way through, because that would be bad. Now, anytime I do a somewhat complicated glue up, I like to do a test fit first and decide how and where I will put all of the clamps. That way I'm not panicking while the glue is drying, trying to figure out what to do. Believe me, it's much less stressful that way. So I installed all of the biscuits and started sticking this thing together. And I had thought, because I put biscuits on the end pieces, that it would be a little tricky to assemble this thing, but it wasn't too bad. Next, I cut a whole bunch of these clamping blocks, and with the help of some CA glue, I started sticking them all over the place. I then disassembled it and laid everything out to make assembly easier. After that, it was time to glue this thing together. So I started applying glue and smearing it around. A little bit of glue here, and a little bit of glue there. Once everything had been lathered up, I started putting it together. And even though the dry assembly went well, for some reason when I started clamping it together, it kept binding. And, well, fought me the whole time. So much for lowering my stress levels, right? But eventually, I did show it who's the boss. I just had to add a few more clamps to this monstrosity.
Then I wiped off the excess glue and used the side of a screwdriver where it would fit to roll over the edges in case there were any gaps. The next day, with coffee in hand, I started removing the 11 million clamps I put on this thing. And while I'm doing that, this is the part where I would say something like, if you made it this far in the video, leave me a comment, crush the like button, and get your free subscription to my channel so you can get notified when there's new content. But I'm not going to say it, so let's move on. With the clamps removed, I then had to remove all of the clamping blocks. And I find the easiest way to do this is with a hammer and hitting the block in the direction of the grain. If you have a stubborn one, you can place a block on top of it so you can hit it harder with less chance of hitting the project and damaging it. And sometimes the blocks split, leaving a small chunk behind, and I just use a wide chisel to remove it. Before we get to everyone's favorite pastime of sanding, which I am not going to bore you with because I'm that kind of guy, but here are a few tips when you need a stain grade finish. One is to draw all over it with a pencil before each grit of sandpaper. That way you know when all of the scratches are gone from the previous grit. And secondly, scrape off any remaining glue first so you don't have to sand as much. Then sand away. If you find any gaps like this corner, the way that I like to fix it is to blow it out with some compressed air, then dab some glue in it and push it into the gap using your finger. Then roll the fibers over with the side of a screwdriver, and while the glue is still wet, lightly sand it by hand, allowing the sawdust to fill any remaining gaps. And if your mitered corner wasn't as aligned as you wanted it to be, and you can see some of the end grain, you can sand it down to give you that perfect mitered corner. And since I'll be using Rubio Monocoat as my finish, I sanded up to 150 grit. Then I used a handheld router with a 1/16 inch round over bit to round over all of the edges. And then I lightly ran a piece of 150 grit sandpaper across the edges. And I like to vacuum the entire project with a soft brush attachment instead of using compressed air. That way there is less dust floating around in my shop to stick to my finish. Like I said, I'm using Rubio Monocoat as my finish, and the color choice is called Smoke. And yes, I did use a Klingon batleth to open the can. Sorry, Worf. Once it was all mixed up, I poured it out and used a card scraper to pull it around. And I'll just squeegee any excess off the edge back into the cup. Then take a white Scotch-Brite pad and work the finish into all of the grain, nooks and crannies. I'm not really sure what a cranny is, but it sounds important, so make sure to get some finish on it. I let it set for 15 minutes and then wiped off the excess with a lint-free rag. And before we install it, here are some glamour shots. Feel free to ooh and ah, or don't. I can't hear it anyway. Now, before I can install the new mantle, there are a few things I need to do first, like removing the shrouding around the fireplace and prepping the wall for that veneer stone we'll install later. So I measured each side from the center line and made a mark on the wall. Then used an 8-foot level to give me a straight line. I did the same thing on the other side, and then measured between to make sure that my lines didn't drift apart. I hate when that happens. Then I used my oscillating saw to cut the baseboard, and then I cut the sheetrock all the way up to the ceiling. You could also use a utility knife to cut the sheetrock, but this is much faster. Oh, and don't forget to cut the drywall tape in the corner of the ceiling and the wall. Then I removed all the old tile on the wall around the fireplace, and of course I also removed all of the sheetrock as well. Once the demo was done, I checked to see how far the studs were on each side of the fireplace, and found that on the right side it was only like 2 inches back, and the left side was only about 3/4 of an inch. So I didn't need to add any additional studs for backing. So I measured the opening of the fireplace and made myself a little drawing to follow. Then I headed outside and marked out my lines on the cement board that'll be hanging on the wall. Once I had all of my lines marked out, I cut it using my skill saw, and since this is a very dusty job, I made sure to wear my OSHA approved dust mask / shirt, I guess. Now, they do make a special blade to cut cement board, but I always keep my old demo blades to cut it with, and it works just fine. Plus, those other blades are really expensive. After I finished my cuts, I went back inside and installed it using the appropriate screws recommended by the manufacturer. And while I do that, I have a genuine question I'd like to ask everyone watching. You may not know this, but I am a general contractor, and of course, this is a woodworking channel. So my question is, do you want me to skim through all the non-woodworking related parts of my builds, such as the veneer stone? Or do you want me to give you more information on how to do the non-woodworking portions of my builds? I figured if you made it this far in the video, then your opinion is the one that I want the most. So let me know in the comments how you want future videos to look by commenting more info, less info, or perfect info if this video has the right amount of non-woodworking info in it for you. Thank you. Next, I needed to mark where I wanted the top of the mantle to be, and a common height is 54 inches. So I marked the height and used a level to make a line. To mount the mantle, I built a simple mount using 2x4 lumber. I cut the back piece that will be mounted to the wall a few inches smaller than the mantle itself to give me some wiggle room to install it. And I cut several shorter pieces of 2x4 that I attached with some 3-inch screws. I then centered the mount and ran in a 3-inch screw just to temporarily hold it in place. Then I made sure it was level and began drilling a pilot hole for the anchor bolts. But after the drill bit went through the 2x4, it just didn't want to go any deeper. So I moved the bracket, and as luck would have it, there was a screw right behind it that I hit with the drill bit. So I just removed the screw, swung the bracket back in place, and finished drilling the hole. I installed the lag bolt, and then I did it 3 more times. Then I grabbed the mantle and slid it into place. Made sure it was level, and secured it in place with a bunch of nails, knowing that they would all be hidden by the veneer stone. Then I marked the wall where my veneer stone was going to stop. I like to overlap the veneer stone onto the sheetrock at least an inch. Then I cut back the baseboard and removed it.
Okay, so now we're ready to install some of our veneer stone. I like to lay it all out on several tables. And the reason for doing this is that as you're grabbing stone, once you have your mortar mixed up and you're installing them, you don't want to be trying to figure out where a certain size is. You don't want to be digging through the back of the truck or your trailer, trying to find the size that's going to fit perfect. So if you have them all laid out, it's easy to walk out here and go, that one, that's going to fit, and grab it and go check it and see if it's going to work or not for you. Because these are veneer stone, they are not all identical, but you will occasionally run across a couple of stones that are from the same mold. So like these ones in particular, even though the texture on the face is slightly different, they are the same shape. So this would be one that I would want to make sure is not side by side. You also don't want to get to the end of your project and realize that you only have large ones left or only small ones left. So you want to pick and choose the different sizes so that as you get to the end of your project, you have an equal amount left over as well. So if you have a lot of big ones, you know that you're going to have to intersperse those throughout your veneer stone as you're installing them, so that you don't end up at the end of the project with a whole bunch of big ones and then it looks funny because your transitions are different, your spacing, or just the general flow of all of your stone is going to look different. So you want to be careful of that. So that's why I like to lay out all of my stone ahead of time.
I then began mixing up some colored S-type mortar. And you only want to mix enough to last about 20 or 30 minutes. It's better to mix up multiple small batches than one big batch that hardens in the bucket. The viscosity you want is similar to peanut butter and should stick to the trowel on its side and upside down. It's also important to wet the surface of the cement board and the back of the veneer stone. Otherwise, the moisture will be sucked out of the mortar too quickly and can cause adhesion problems. After that, you can start applying mortar to the back of the veneer stone and start installing them. Because this type of veneer stone is designed for grout lines as opposed to a dry stack look, you'll probably notice the yellow shims that I'm using throughout this project. This is to help position some of the stones to give me the desired grout line thickness in that location. And to keep the stones from sliding down and falling onto the fireplace, I installed a 2x4 to rest the stones on, and I'll just remove it later. And though I didn't show it, I put a fiberglass mesh tape over the seam of the cement board and put a skim coat of mortar over it. Once I got up to the mantle, I did have to cut a few of the stones. So I use a pencil to mark the stone and a diamond blade cut-off wheel on the grinder to cut it. And you really don't want to breathe in all this dust, so make sure you have a good dust mask and don't just pull your shirt over your nose. This is a do as I say, not as I do situation. Once I got past the mantle, I didn't have to cut any more stones until I got to the ceiling. And because these are vaulted ceilings, I had to figure out the angle before I made my cuts. But before you know it, you'll have the last piece of stone installed. The next day I mixed up some more colored mortar, but this time I made the viscosity a lot lower so I can squeeze it out of a grout bag. Then I proceeded to fill all of the joints to the desired depth. And after the mortar has rested for a few minutes, you can come back through and press it into the joints to flatten them out. The next day I vacuumed all of the stone using a brush attachment. This will help remove any dust and loose sand from the mortar. Then I poured some stone enhancer / sealer into a spray bottle and started spraying the stone. And you will want to have a paintbrush to get drips and even out the sealer. I like to do 2 or 3 coats. I did some paint touch-ups, and then I reinstalled the metal shrouding around the fireplace.
First Christmas present of the year. Oh my goodness. It looks so good. Oh my gosh, I love it.
Now that we're done with our mantle, I finally have a place to hang my stocking. Only problem now is this isn't my wife, and honestly, this isn't my house. I think I should go. Should I go?
Maybe.
I'm gonna go.